Habiendo dicho esto, Daniel, gracias. Habiendo dicho esto, quiero darles un afectuoso saludo, buenos días desde el cono sur del mundo. Es una alegría poder encontrarnos hoy en esta conferencia para dialogar y escuchar cuatro voces autorizadas sobre la situación de hoy en los territorios ocupados de Palestina. Este diálogo está marcado por la Declaración de Barmen de 1934 y su voz profética anunciando la fidelidad a Dios y no a los seres humanos. Esto es casi como una actualización de las sabias palabras que encontramos en el libro de Hechos de los Apóstoles, capítulo 5, versículos 29. Desde ella, el doctor Ulrich Duchrow nos estará guiando en una aproximación teológica a lo que estamos viviendo hoy en Palestina. Cómo mirar la situación de ocupación, apartheid y genocidio que sufre hoy la población palestina. Esta es la pregunta que el doctor Duchrow estará animando a que pensemos juntos. Un segundo aspecto de esta conferencia está marcado por la potente y también profética voz de la Confesión de Belhar, escrita en 1982 y adoptada inicialmente por la Iglesia Misión Reformada holandesa y luego por un gran número de iglesias del mundo ecuménico. Esta confesión fue escrita en protesta contra la herejía de la Iglesia Reformada holandesa que usó tanto la Biblia como las confesiones de fe para justificar teológicamente el cruel e injusto sistema de apartheid. El doctor Alan Bosak fue uno de los teólogos que inspiró y trabajó en la elaboración de esta confesión, y hoy nos ayudará a mirar la situación palestina desde esa experiencia de resistencia y sobre todo de superación del apartheid en Sudáfrica. La tercera conferencista que nos acompaña hoy es la hermana magíster Muna Nassar, que nos traerá una voz palestina a este diálogo. Mucho se ha elaborado en teología desde Palestina. Sin embargo, aún hoy esta es poco conocida en el mundo de habla hispana. A esto se suma la continua desinformación que busca entender de determinada forma la situación en Palestina, ignorando el proceso histórico y la realidad cotidiana que padecen millones de palestinos. Muna Nassar nos desafiará a no perder de vista el largo contexto de opresión que sufre su pueblo y nos compartirá cómo las teologías palestinas están acompañando a su pueblo en estos tiempos. Ya más de 75 años de pérdida de su tierra, desplazamientos y apartheid. Finalmente, al organizar esta conferencia, no podíamos perder de vista la fuerte influencia que existe en nuestra región, en el mundo evangélico, pero también en el mundo católico, donde en muchos casos se da por sentada la correlación entre el Israel bíblico y el actual Estado de Israel. Nuestra región de América Latina ha recibido una gran influencia desde los Estados Unidos para blindar teológica y éticamente al Estado de Israel. La licenciada Paula Fogel nos traerá una voz desde Argentina para ayudarnos a unir los puntos y ver cuáles son los desafíos que la situación en Palestina implica para las teologías latinoamericanas. Cada uno de ellos hará una exposición de 15 minutos y los iré introduciendo primeramente a cada uno de ellos, empezando ahora por el doctor Duchrow, que es quien nos va a guiar en la primera parte de esta conferencia. El doctor Ulrich Duchrow es casado, tiene 3 hijos, tiene 7 nietos, es profesor de la Universidad de Heidelberg en Alemania, profesor en teología sistemática, especialmente en el área de teología ecuménica y social, así como también en temas de religión y teología. Ulrich es cofundador y presidente honorario de Kairos Europa, una red ecuménica de base que lucha por la justicia económica y ecológica. Es cofundador y co-moderador de la red de solidaridad Kairos Palestina alemana y miembro de la Comisión de Teología de Kairos Global por la Justicia. Es autor de una gran variedad de libros y artículos en estas áreas que sería imposible resumir. Así que, estimado Ulrich, te damos la bienvenida y la gratitud inmensa de contar contigo y tienes tus 15 minutos, Ulrich. Adelante.
Thank you very much, Dario. It's a real honor and wonderful joy to be with you in this group. My theme is how Barmen helps us to understand the situation and a theological response to the colonization, apartheid, and genocide against the Palestinian people. The Barmen Theological Declaration of 1934 is a watershed event in the history of the Reformation churches and world Christianity as a whole. It was a response, as you all know, to the takeover of the German Protestant church by the German Christians, Deutsche Christen, in the church elections in July 1933. The so-called Young Reformation movement rose up against this and called for a confessing church. Confessing congregations and brotherhoods were formed. The Pfarrernotbund Emergency Alliance of Pastors was founded as early as September 1933, and Martin Niemöller called... I'm sorry? Yeah. Martin Niemöller called on all pastors to join, which 7,000 did by 1934. The Reich Bishop fought against them with dismissals, etc. The Brother Council convened the Confessional Synod in Barmen, May 1934. Committees were formed, particularly a theological committee. The most important person in that was Karl Barth, as you all know. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was not there, but he had already done a very important job for our question on Palestine, because he called the churches to have status confessionis in the case a state does disenfranchisement towards a group of people and also mix into the matters of faith, which I later will refer to in the context of Kairos Palestine. The Confessing Synod in Barmen did not follow this specific approach, starting with the persecution of the Jews. After the war, Karl Barth apologized for omitting the Jewish question in Barmen. However, against the Nazi heresy of one people, one Reich, one Führer, the Barmen Declaration clearly said, solus Christus. Christ alone is Lord and the guiding principle in all across life and in terms of the message and order of the churches. After that time, several contexts in which the Barmen Declaration was already or has already provided inspiration for further confessing. But before I go to those examples, let me quickly talk about the method. It is a process that we are talking about. Bonhoeffer also supported this, and Eberhard Bethge, his friend, distinguished recognizing, decision-making, and responding in praxis. And therefore, in 1982, I introduced the word processus confessionis, and you will see it was picked up by the World Alliance of Reformed Churches. So Bonhoeffer said the confession must never start by excluding others, but rather to confess Christ, starting with your own participation in the sinful system, to involve the whole church in the process, and finally follow with practical consequences of the confession. in relation to the church in error and the false church. And the false church is identified by joining the persecution of the true church. This is just very briefly, we can expand it in English in the discussions. Now, some examples inspired by Barmen. I myself was involved in the first revisiting of Barmen in the Lutheran World Federation in the 1970s. We were confronted with apartheid in South Africa, and we organized a study process leading to the decision at the Assembly of the Lutheran World Federation 1977 in Dar es Salaam, producing a confession saying, we especially appeal to our white member churches in Southern Africa to recognize that the situation in Southern Africa constitutes a status confessionis. This means that on the basis of faith and in order to manifest the unity of the church, churches would publicly and unequivocally reject the existing apartheid system. As a consequence, the membership of the white Lutheran churches in Southern Africa was suspended at the following assembly in 1984 after they did not follow this decision. And they had excluded themselves in the terminology of Bonhoeffer, which was then established by the suspension. The World Alliance of Reformed Churches sued in 1982 in Ottawa and declared apartheid a heresy. Alan Bussack will talk about that. Barmen was involved for the second time when the West wanted to install missiles equipped with weapons of mass destruction in Europe. The reformed Moderamen in Germany in particular campaigned for that, but in this case, they did not succeed. But a third time was very successful. In 1983, the Assembly of the WCC in Vancouver called for a conciliar process for justice, peace, and the integrity of creation with regard to the global economy. This was an attempt to use the term conciliar in terms of a confessional issue. Under the leadership of General Secretary Milan Opocensky in World Alliance of Reformed Churches, then used the term processus and status confessionis from 1990 onwards for the continuation of the conciliar process, when it picked up my proposal to work on the global capitalist economy as a confessional issue. In 1998, the WCC joined, then the LWF. So then after 2000, the LWF, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, the most famous decision in Accra Confession in 2004, and then the WCC in Busan in 2013, Barmen was explicitly used as template when the World Alliance of Reformed Churches formulated its Accra Confession and said, we believe God is sovereign, so therefore we reject the current world economic order imposed by global neoliberal capitalism, which defy God's covenant by excluding the poor, etc. We also reject any claim of economic, political, and military empire, which subverts God's sovereignty over life and acts contrary to God's rule. So that means a kind of church historical thing is that in 30 years of work, all major international church institutions rejected imperial capitalism as a confessional issue. Now, it is in this global capitalist racist apartheid system led by the USA, in the framework of which we face the most urgent issue of status confessionis today, Israel's apartheid and genocidal system against the Palestinians. A worldwide ecumenical process of recognition, confession, and action is already underway on Palestine, Israel, triggered by the cry for hope from Kairos, Palestine, but also by the resolution of the WCC Assembly in Karlsruhe, asking for the study of the NGO reports on apartheid in Israel. And this is about the disenfranchisement of the Palestinians and the misuse of the Bible to justify this injustice in Zionism, especially Christian Zionism. The cry for hope already builds on Barmen, Bonhoeffer, and the decisions on South Africa apartheid, calling the churches to get involved in a processus confessionis. I have no time to quote from the cry, but you can read it on internet. Now, several churches have responded from South Africa, the USA, UK, Scandinavia, even one German bishop. Now, the most impressive answer came from the United Church of Christ in the United States. And therefore, as an example, I will quote a few sentences from that confession tailored after Barmen. So they say, the 33rd General Synod of the United Church of Christ adopts the following declaration after an introduction as with follow-up on actions. 1, we affirm that the continued oppression of the Palestinian people represent a fundamental denial of the gospel. Therefore, we reject the notion that Israel's occupation of Palestine is a purely political problem outside the concern of the church. 2, we affirm the biblical narrative beginning with creation, which speaks of God's blessing extending to all families of the earth. Therefore, we reject any theology or ideology, including Christian Zionism, that would privilege or exclude any one nation, race, culture, or religion within God's universal economy. 3, all people living in Palestine and Israel are created in the image of God. Therefore, we reject any laws and legal procedures which are used by one race then to enshrine one people in a privileged legal position, including Israel's apartheid. 4, that all peoples have the right to self-determination, and that just resolution of conflict claims about land and resources. Therefore, we reject the use of scripture, claim the right to the land as rationale for Israel, illegal seizure. 5, we affirm the rights of Palestinian refugees. And then 6, we also fight for the constitutional right of free expression, so that even when we participate in BDS boycott, then we should not be called anti-Semites. So we reject the idea that any criticism of policies of the state of Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. So this is exemplary. Therefore, I thought it is important to quote some of it. Now, in Germany, the official churches are silent, but we, with the Solidarity Network to Kairos Palestine, have organized the process in terms of working on the question, is Israel an apartheid system? And we have published brochures and organized seminars in congregations, 4-part seminars. And so, in this sense, we are trying to be part of the ecumenical movement. Now, recently, the World Community of Reformed Churches and others have issued a most important statement in relation to our issue on Israel's genocide in Gaza as part of a global empire. So, in summarizing, Barmen is most relevant after 90 years. Inspired by several historic engagement, we saw the follow-up now already. And so let us all follow the example of the UCC. 1, to confess Christ, beginning with the confession of our own and the church's sins. to involve the whole church worldwide in a process in which the confession against the disenfranchisement of the Palestinians and pseudo-biblical justification is jointly formulated and put into action, and finally to draw the practical consequences by supporting the resisting sumud of the Palestinians and asking and confronting our governments to link any cooperation with Israel to the fulfillment of international law and human rights. Thank you.
Ulrich, thank you so much for that, and we should clap for that. And also that you were 15 minutes by watch. So thank you so much that I didn't need to interrupt you. And I'm very glad that you are on the table and you inspire us with your message. And please keep writing your question and so on. We will come back on Ulrich. Now we will open the floor for Professor Alan Bosak. Alan is perdón, voy a hablar en español, disculpen, me quedo confundido. El profesor Alan Bosak es un teólogo negro de la liberación sudafricano, autor y activista contra el apartheid y a favor de los derechos humanos en todo el mundo. Le apasiona especialmente predicar, ya se van a dar cuenta de eso, hablar en público y ser mentor de una nueva generación de teólogos jóvenes en Sudáfrica y en otras partes del mundo. Es un apasionado de Palestina y de su actual compromiso con otros en un programa de acción llamado Despierta, Levántate, Reconstruye, que intenta despertar a las comunidades religiosas para que recuperen su testimonio profético y su fidelidad respecto a la actual situación política en Sudáfrica. Alan, un placer contar contigo. Bien, has venido a esta mesa y tienes tus 15 minutos. Muchas gracias. Alan, estás silenciado.
No, I'm there. Thank you. It's so good to be with all of you. Good afternoon and good morning. I am privileged to be part of this conversation. The title of my talk today is Written on the Tables of Our Hearts, and it is on Belhar, who in turn has built on Barmen and focusing on the Palestinian question. Now, I was privileged to be a member of the commission tasked by the Synod of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church to execute the decision of Synod, namely to produce a confession for our times and our situation, and that was in 1982. In 1986, after making the formal rounds for discussion and debate through presbyteries and congregations, I was moderator of Synod and in the chair when the Belhar Confession was finally adopted as a fourth confession of our church, added to the existing confessions Reformed churches in South Africa inherited from Europe and had already accepted as standards of the church. I mean the Belgic Confession of 1561, the Heidelberg Catechism of 1563, and the Canons of Dort from 1619. The first Reformed confession to come out of Africa after 366 years. The very name the confession carries is already loaded with significance and the signifier of its origins, its message, its intentions, its embrace of its 5 pillars: the Lordship of Jesus Christ, unity, reconciliation, justice, and the response of believers in obedience to Jesus Christ. Belhar is the neighborhood where the Synod of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, the so-called colored daughter of the white mother church, met in 1986. Belhar is an area in Cape Town established for South Africans classified colored under apartheid's racial classification, forcibly removed from their homes and land by apartheid laws, uprooted from their communities, dislodged from their historical connections, deprived of their memories and their sense of belonging. But it is more than that. It arises from a history of colonization, land theft, genocide, and displacement, of alienation and dispossession, from the devastating horrors of the stratified oppressions of race, class, and gender, of apartheid, pigmentocracy, and demonization in all its terrifying manifestations. In that sense, Belhar represents a condition of oppression, rejection, and alienation. And it is from within that condition that this confession arises. It is a confession from the oppressed by the oppressed, from within the struggles of the oppressed with God and with life, and from within the longings for freedom and dignity. Hence, it is also a condition of struggle for freedom, justice, and dignity. That is how we understand Palestine, no longer a place on a map, but a condition of Zionist new colonization, land theft, occupation, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. At the same time, though, it is a condition of a people arising, claiming their rights as children of God, as owners of their land, and as John Calvin said, resisting tyranny as a duty in obedience to this God of justice and freedom whom we worship. The Dutch Reformed Mission Church was a church established by the White Dutch Reformed Church in 1881, a result of that church's mission policy formed in 1857, now widely recognized as the forerunner of the political policy of apartheid. For over 120 years, that decision to divide the church on the basis of race, now recognized as the birth of a heresy, remained virtually unchallenged. For almost a century, that church was controlled by the white church in every way possible, with pastors from the white church acting as overseers, leaders, and spokespersons. Since our awakening, though, during the 1976 Soweto Revolution, the Synod of 1978, and our participation in the anti-apartheid struggle in the 1980s, our church, as a church of the oppressed and the marginalized, had developed a theology and a voice of its own. And it is that voice one hears in the Belhar Confession. Important to know is that this mission policy of the White Dutch Reformed Church from 1857 became the model for apartheid, the political policy of the white minority government in 1948. And just as the theology of apartheid justified land theft, dehumanization, genocide, white supremacy, colonialist oppression, and apartheid, so does the theology of Christian Zionism. And it is for that same reason that we are at this very moment petitioning the World Communion of Reformed Churches to declare Christian Zionism a travesty of the gospel, a sin and a heresy, just as it did regarding apartheid and its theology in 1982. Belhar is indeed, as has been said, a cry from the heart. It does come from our heart, but before it comes from our heart, it comes from the heart of God. And I say this because I believe John Calvin is right, and I quote him now. Tyrants and their cruelty cannot be endured without great weariness and sorrow. Hence, almost the whole world sounds forth these words, how long? When anyone disturbs the whole world by ambition and avarice, or everywhere commits plunders or oppresses miserable nations, when he distresses the innocent, all cry out, how long? And this cry, Calvin says, proceeding as it does from the feeling of nature and the dictates of justice, is at length heard by the Lord. The oppressed know that this confusion of order and justice is not to be endured. And this feeling, is it not implanted in us by the Lord? It is then the same as though God heard God's self when God hears the cries and groaning of those who cannot bear injustice. And so the cry from the heart of Palestinian pain and suffering, captured in Cairo's Palestine, is the cry from the very heart of God. It is the cry from the depths of oppression and from the midst of extermination, from the festering wounds from those still dying under the rubble. But it is also the cry of a people and a church awakening and arising, resolutely and faithfully declaring the lordship of Jesus Christ. So my intention today is to highlight Belhar in his call for justice, even though what I say here will be equally applicable to every other issue raised in the confession. And so Article 4, especially from Belhar, we will concentrate on and pay close attention to what we say there. We believe that God has revealed God's self as the one who wishes to bring about justice and true peace on earth. That in a world full of injustice and enmity, God is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged, and that God calls the church to follow God in this. So I will skip the rest because that comes from the Bible, but then go on to what Belhar asks us to do, namely in the following paragraphs over here, that the church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need, which implies, among other things, that the church must witness against and strive against any form of injustice, so that justice may roll down like waters and righteousness like an overflowing stream. And as if already and prophetically identifying and rising up against the politics of greed and corruption, of self-aggrandizement and self-centeredness that would become the post-1994 plagues visited upon our people here in South Africa, Belhar insists, quote, that the church as the possession of God should stand where God stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged, that in following Christ, the church must witness against all the powerful and privileged who selfishly seek their own interests and thus control and harm others. This is the language of radical prophetic discipleship. Belhar, more than any other confession in the Reformed tradition, speaks directly, unapologetically, and unashamedly of God as a God of indivisible, radical justice, indivisible, radical equality, and indivisible, radical inclusivity. When studies the Belhar text, one notices that it is replete with biblical references. Not because of some fundamentalist biblicist compulsion, that is, randomly grabbing text from the Bible to prove a point, but because of the desire to anchor itself in and hold on to the enduring biblical truths that are the source of our life and our strength. That liberating word of God that endures forever. And so again, Sylvia, I will skip the references to the Bible we have there and go to the following paragraph. But here is the thing. Jesus, Luke tells us in Luke chapter 4, verse 16 to 18, reads from the book of Isaiah. However, not only does Jesus bring together two passages of serious judgment of injustice and a radical call for justice from two separate chapters, Isaiah 58 and 61, Jesus goes further. In the verses that follow, Jesus departs from Isaiah, radicalizes those passages, and speaks of God's love, grace, and mercy and justice, not just for Israel, but for the other nations as well. Jesus intentionally breaks down the walls of racial separation, rejects the ideologies of nationalist exclusivism, and overturns the teachings of religious favoritism. It is then that even those who marveled at his teaching a moment before become so outraged that they wanted to throw him off the cliff. And what Jesus does is enhancing God's radical, indivisible justice and the same indivisible inequality, indivisible solidarity, and indivisible radical inclusivity. And that is the spirit that Belhar seeks to encapsulate. I will skip the following paragraph on Paul and go on the next page, Sylvia. For our church, Belhar clearly was a defining moment. But more than that, it remains a defining presence for us. And by defining presence, I mean, firstly, that whatever the moment of history, Belhar, and hence the church, will always be defined by its obedience to Christ as Lord, by its rootedness in and commitment to unity, reconciliation, and compassionate radical justice. Secondly, that Belhar cannot and will not be confined to a single static moment in our history, as if it's self-defined by that moment. In other words, Belhar cannot and will not be seen as a response to racism only, and even more narrowly to apartheid only. When we spoke of Belhar as a moment of truth, we did not mean that we had all of a sudden discovered the truth about apartheid and new colonialism. Nothing of all that was unknown by the people who had suffered under it for so long. We meant that we had discovered the truth about the God we worship, about the church and our testimony in the world, about the nature of our response to oppression and the call for justice, and about our prophetic faithfulness. It is not so much that we had discovered the truth. The truth was always there in the scriptures, in the testimony of the prophets, in the words, life, and ministry of Jesus, and in the real lived experience of our people through these 3.5 centuries of suffering and death. It is far more that the truth had finally discovered and overcome us. And as with the prophet Jeremiah, it is something like a fire shut up in our bones. And just like the people of Palestine, in response to endless betrayal, endless Nakba, endless colonialist occupation, endless genocide, we cannot hold it in. However, the church in that Kairos moment, as a Reformed church, needed the spiritual discernment, the spiritual weight, the spiritual commitment, and the spiritual obligations only a confession can demand. The Reformed tradition understands that uniquely. And a confession is what we make, trembling in awe before the awesomeness of God's power when we worship, so that we do not tremble in fear before the powers of the world where the confession is lived and where we struggle for justice, hope, and life. I skipped those. No, I will say this. Hence the embrace of those heavily loaded words, heresy, blasphemy, and a travesty of the gospel. We made a confession offered as a living prayer for the boldness to be truthful, prophetic, and faithful. We proclaim the confession as a need to define the well-being of the church for the sake of the well-being of the world. In a post-99 South Africa, Belhar continues to define, still today, who we are and what we are, our understandings of the demand of the scriptures, our response to the great global challenges facing the church today. Belhar comes from oppressed communities who themselves were bereft of their voice, yet chosen by God to speak truth to power. With no name in the street, as the book of Job so poignantly calls the wretched of the earth, yet they dared to name God in the sanctuary, as well as in the public square, in the inner prayer room, as well as in the streets of protest and confrontation for the sake of justice and freedom. And in that sense, Belhar itself becomes a demystifying, decolonizing, and humanizing act. I will skip that following paragraph, and I will skip the question of the scandalon, but I will go to the end of that paragraph. Belhar embodies, with almost shocking clarity, the heart of the Reformed tradition in the matters of justice. Hence, Belhar's insistence that we, the church, as the body of Christ, and individuals, followers of Jesus of Nazareth, stand against all forms of injustice, wherever they may be found, and against all the powerful and privileged who in their greed and corruption, their arrogant sense of entitlement and destructive solipsism are maintaining our country's scandalous status as the most unequal society on earth while oppressing, exploiting, and demonizing God's vulnerable children across the globe. And it is in this particular moment enacting, enabling, and justifying the genocide of the people of Palestine. We are called to stand against all bigotry, baptized or otherwise, all patriarchy, sanctified or otherwise, against all homophobia and transphobia, deified or otherwise. And with Belhar, we reject every ideology that justifies this, every policy that legitimizes this, and every theology that sacralizes this. In that confession is all the truth that makes us free, all the wisdom to keep us humble, and all the faith to know the way, all the hope to give us courage, and all the strength to make us love, and all the joy to keep us human. In Palestine, the next paragraph, Sylvia, a few years ago, where, by the way, the Belhar Confession is deeply revered and redeemed inspirational, I stood before the Israeli-built apartheid wall on stolen land, and it was as if I saw Belhar written on that wall. The words on that wall were different, but the meaning is the same. Someone has written, "This wall may take care of the present, but it has no future." It is the answer to all humiliation, all the lies, all the violent oppression, all the death and destruction, all the helplessness and hopelessness. It is the answer to all the insufferable death-dealing arrogance of the occupation. Those words symbolizes all our words of racial supremacy and ethnic nationalism, all the exclusivism and bigotry, all hypocrisy and fear, of entitlement and selfishness, of carelessness and of depraved indifference. Those words are the most defiantly truthful, the most audaciously hopeful, and the most courageously prophetic expression of the first and most stubborn confession of the church throughout the ages, namely, Jesus is Lord. So let me close with this. This is what that wall is saying. That wall is the Pharaoh saying, "Who is the Lord that I should listen to his voice?" But the people answer, "Jesus is Lord." That wall is Nebuchadnezzar saying, "Who is this God who will rescue you from my hand?" The people answer, "Jesus is Lord." That wall is the prophet Jeremiah's anguished cry, "Is there a balm in Gilead?" The people answer, "Jesus is Lord." That wall is the Rachel weeping for her children because they are no more, just like in Palestine. But the people answer, "Jesus is Lord." That wall is Jesus weeping for Jerusalem, but the people confess, "Jesus is Lord." That wall is the mocker saying, "If you are the Son of God, come off from that cross." But the people answer, "Jesus is Lord." So in Palestine, where the bombs are falling and everywhere injustice reigns, we stand upon it, because Belhar is not just a confession on paper. It is a letter of Jesus Christ, as Paul says, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of the human heart. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I had to rush through this, but it might have been longer than the 50 minutes our chairperson has allotted me.
Thank you, Alan. I was tempted to say, "Preach, brother, preach," but that will take you much time. Thank you so much, Alan. I really enjoy your presentation, and thank you for giving us a lot to think about and to build our Christian testimony in the face of the genocide of the Palestinian people. Talking about that, just welcome to the people that join us. It's a pleasure to have you with us. Keep your questions for later, that we will have a time for a conversation. And now we will welcome to Muna Nassa, who is a Palestinian Christian woman from Bethlehem, an advocate for justice for the Palestinian people. Muna has working as a project coordinator for Kairos Palestine, In 2022, she obtained a Master of a philosophy in intercultural theology and interreligious studies from Trinity College in Dublin. In December 22, Muna joined the World Communion of Reformed Churches based in Hanover, Germany, as Executive Secretary for Mission and Advocacy. As a writer, she aims to articulate and represent the diversity of Palestine and Palestinians, highlighting their voice and agency. Welcome, Muna. And the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Dario. And thank you to everyone who is here and who is interested to know more about Palestine. It's always hard to speak after Alan Bosak, but I'll try my best. So I just wanted today to reflect on many things that we are hearing on the news, but I also wanted to reflect about how we hear Palestine and we hear the content of Palestine and the importance of also hearing from Palestine rather than hearing on Palestine. So yeah, I think it's important today when we are hearing so much about Palestine in the news to be reminded that this didn't start in October last year. And also that October did not happen in vacuum. It is crucial to be reminded that prior to October, Palestinians have been living under military occupation for the past 76 years, that Palestinians in Gaza have been living under siege, blocked by air, land, and sea for the past 16 years, that generations and generations of Palestinians have been growing up under a system that deems their existence as a problem, and that is literally taking away their land, their livelihood from them. And today, I think it's important for us to be reminded when we are hearing so much about Palestine to really listen and to really discern on what's happening. Theology has played a role from the beginning and have accompanied many colonial empires and has supported the ethnic cleansing of many communities around the world. It has paved the way for an ideological acceptance of the evil acts of colonialism that is unleashed on the other, that is unleashed on certain races and certain ethnicity. Theology has provided a pretext in enabling the empire and in oppressing the people. In the past, the Bible has been continuously misused to justify slavery, to justify apartheid, and to justify colonialism. For us, Palestinian Christians, we have watched the Bible being continuously misused by the Western Church to justify our oppression, to normalize the illegal Israeli occupation, and in other words, to say that God is really okay with all the injustice being inflicted on us. Not even okay, but God is a crucial part and actor into this discourse. So theology continues today to serve that purpose of justifying the continuation of occupation in Palestine, but for the past year, the annihilation of whole communities as well. In a recent encounter, and after speaking in an ecumenical space about my lived realities of what it means to be a Palestinian Christian nowadays, and to be advocating for justice and liberation, but also in relation to what it means to be watching a genocide day in and day out unfold before our own eyes, I received a question from an ordained minister who was completely unable to understand the logic of why Palestinians fought and revoluted on October 7 last year. In his words, he asked, weren't people thinking that Israel is bound to react mercilessly and that there will be catastrophic results and losses of Palestinian lives? And while his question didn't really surprise me, as there is a general discourse and consensus about how Israel have the right to defend itself, What really shocked me is the normalization and the absolute acceptance of Israel's merciless, inhumane wrath, and parallel to that is his acceptance of Palestinians being continuously murdered. It's as if people have normalized that these are conditions that Palestinians have lived under for decades. So why are they resisting, in his own words, and why are they even trying? And for that, we need to listen to the Palestinian voices that needs to be amplified, because people need to shake the status quo of a reality that puts the Palestinian people in an open-air prison, and the world seems to be unbothered by it until the Palestinians revolt. So, I mean, looking at the news today and hearing the analysis of the systematic oppression that the Palestinian people have lived under for 76 years, but with the intensity and ferocity that has multiplied for the past year, it all indicates that Palestinians live under a system of apartheid, a system that deems them as a problem just because they exist and continue to try to exist on their land. For years, Palestinians have been saying that we do live under apartheid, but without the credibility being afforded to us. However, international human rights have finally declared that what is happening in Palestine is apartheid. So my question is, as a church today, how is it possible to describe prophetically what is happening in Palestine and to speak truth to power about Palestine? How can the church all over the world refrain from challenging the empire when we need it the most? While for years we have discerned, witnessed, and heard what the empire has done and continues to do until this day, not just in Palestine, but in many different contexts. So then how is it possible that the church is still silent about the atrocities in Palestine? And how are we as Christians okay with our witness being at stake? Furthermore, we unequivocally reject the narrow and misguided Christian responses that overlook the broader context and the root causes of this conflict. Israel's systematic oppression of Palestinians over the past 76 years since the Nakba, the ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, and the brutal racist military occupation all amounts that this is apartheid. This is the very context of the horrific oppression that many Western Christian theologians and leaders have continuously ignored, and even more troubling, have sometimes legitimized through various Zionist theologies and interpretations. The Barmen Declaration of 1934 reinforced the Church's obligation to stand up to injustice and to unequivocally oppose ideologies of tyranny. The Palestinian theologies today are documenting how the Bible have been misused continuously to propel oppression on our own being. However, it also serves to document the Western theology's complicities that continues to pave the way and almost are walking in lockstep with Israel in its systematic ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. Today, and as the Accra Confession said, the signs of the times have become more alarming and must be interpreted. However, I think we are beyond the point of no return. There can no longer be a time for churches to say it's too complicated. There can be no longer a time for the churches to be silent about ethnic cleansing and genocide being committed using the scripture and the Bible to do so. There is no local reality that is not impacted by global forces and power dynamic. Gaza today serves to show the empire's tool and machinery, both ideological and military ones. And although we acknowledge that many voices have spoken and continue to speak for truth and justice for Palestine and for Palestinians, we as Palestinians are horrified by the Western theologians and the church leaders who have offered unabated support for Israel. Thus, we as Palestinian Christians and through the Palestinian theologies continue to urge them to wake up because it is too late. And unfortunately, the actions and the double standards of some Christian leaders have deeply damaged their Christian witness and have seriously compromised their moral judgment that have normalized and provided theological cover to the ethnic cleansing and the annihilation of the Palestinian people. Justice really lies at the very heart of the Palestinian problem. And that is why Palestine is a justice issue, not just for Palestine and for Palestinians, but for every liberation cause around the world, for every nation that has endured and witnessed what colonialism and ethnic cleansing is. That's why if Palestine is liberated, several other colonial movements would be revived or start anew. And that's why we see the Palestinian flag become a symbol for justice and righteousness in struggles around the world, especially in the global South. And that's why we also see the Israeli flag appear with the most dangerous figures like in right-wing's movement in Brazil and in Argentina. Today, what is happening in Gaza and in the West Bank characterizes the Palestinian people resistance over the decades. They have defied many military systems that have put in place to challenge their existence. The fact that there is still a community that has survived the Nakba in 1948, the Naksa in 1967, the first and the second Intifada, the multiple wars on Gaza, and the current genocide has proved and produced something that is distinctly Palestinian, and that is sumud. Sumud is an Arabic word that means perseverance and resilience, and it is anchored in the strive of the Palestinian people to a cause of justice and historical rootedness in this land. That this land that has seen years of suffering and persecution, but continues to propel the sense of steadfastness towards achieving hope for a people on the land. And through this belief that with hope and with faith, we continue to exist as a community. Furthermore, when we talk about sumud, it's important to remember that sumud is something that we Palestinians don't choose amongst many options, because it's the only option that remains. It's a lifestyle that really brought up generations and generations, and it's the costs that thousands of families, thousands of mothers and fathers are paying for justice and for freedom for the land. It's about a sense of rootedness that Palestinians have to the land that witnessed destruction, that witnesses bombing. It is a land that Palestinians cannot separate their identities and their belonging from, and it propels a feeling of hope and faithfulness. And in difficult times like these, when the integrity of the Christian church is tested by injustice, we are reminded that we cannot stay silent and that we need to respond with prophetic theological proclamation, such as those expressed in statements like Barmen, like Belhar, and like Akra. Thank you.
Thank you, Muna. Thank you so much for your words and for your perseverance and our resistance in this time. So thank you so much for that. And now I think that Paula, you will speak in Spanish, don't you? Okay. Those that need to listen in English, you will need to enter into the interpretation room, clicking on the globe under interpretation and choose English, and it's very important that you mute the original audio. To test that you're already do that, I will present Paula in Spanish. Paula Fogel es pastora de la Iglesia Evangélica del Río de la Plata, es miembro activa de la Coordinación Nacional del Programa Ecuménico de acompañamiento a Palestina e Israel del Consejo Mundial de Iglesias. Es licenciada en Teología por el Instituto Superior Evangélico de Estudios Teológicos y obtuvo una diplomatura en Violencia de Género. Actualmente es estudiante de la maestría en Trabajo Social. Paula, bienvenida y el piso es tuyo.
Muchas gracias, Darío, y gracias también a Ulrich, a Alan y a Muna por sus excelentes presentaciones. La pregunta que me compartieron para motivar esta reflexión dice: ¿qué relevancia tiene este tema para las iglesias y las teologías latinoamericanas? Y quiero comenzar con una cita de Pilar Cancelo en su libro La metáfora de los árboles, Palestina, que dice: en una lógica de miradas sur-sur, América Latina y Palestina son dos empresas coloniales basadas en mitos fundacionales similares. En ambos casos, la misión de civilizar, la superioridad blanca y la idea de tierras vacías. Los hombres y mujeres con quienes dialogué pidieron una sola cosa: cuenten lo que ven. Quiero primeramente agradecer a Dios esta oportunidad de compartir un tiempo de reflexión con ustedes y colaborar con un pequeño aporte reflexivo en torno a este conversatorio de Barmen a Palestina. Un conversatorio que desde diversas miradas intentará sembrar una mayor y más clara conciencia sobre el más grande escándalo de la historia contemporánea: el genocidio actual, el apartheid y la colonización que lleva adelante el Estado sionista en Palestina desde hace más de 76 años. A su vez, y en medio de estos espacios de reflexión, intentan provocar nuestra rabia frente a la injusticia y el deseo de transformarlo todo, allí desde donde estemos, desde donde Dios nos ha llamado a servirle. Porque en el espíritu de amplificar las voces del pueblo palestino, no podemos sino seguir luchando, resistiendo, sembrando, con la frente en alto, con la sonrisa grande y con una fe tenaz. Porque creemos en un Dios que libera y que interviene en medio de la historia. A su vez, que nos llama desde cada uno de nuestros dones a aportar en esta liberación, que no es estática, sino dinámica a lo largo y a lo ancho de la historia y del mundo habitado. Soy pastora ordenada por la Iglesia Evangélica del Río de la Plata, y en el año 2015, por un periodo de 3 meses, tuve la gracia de ser acompañante ecuménica por el programa de acompañamiento ecuménico en Palestina e Israel del Consejo Mundial de Iglesias. Allí compartí la vida con otros y otras acompañantes llegados desde diversos lugares del mundo, y me convencí de la fuerza que tiene la solidaridad entre los pueblos y las similitudes que tienen las miradas y las luchas desde nuestras territorialidades sur-sur. Viví durante 3 meses en Yanún, una aldea situada en el norte de Cisjordania, en Nablus, Palestina. Me enamoré de la tierra, de su gente, de los aromas del campo al amanecer, de los olivos, de las comidas, de cada conversación, café o té de por medio, y traje conmigo un pedido testimonial: vayan y cuenten lo que han visto y oído. Este espacio entonces intenta ser un espacio más de advocacy, en la tarea de presionar desde nuestros testimonios para poner fin a la ocupación ilegal y colonial que sufre y resiste el pueblo palestino. ¿Qué relevancia tiene este tema para las iglesias y las teologías latinoamericanas? Creo tenazmente que tanto el aporte de la Declaración de Barmen como Accra y Belhar son faros que pueden guiar nuestros pasos y ayudarnos a discernir cuál es el horizonte de consensos mínimos necesarios que necesitamos de forma urgente en el movimiento cristiano. Específicamente, este es un llamado al cristianismo en América Latina y en mi querida Argentina. Es relevante la temática porque las iglesias y las teologías latinoamericanas tienen una historia de organización y lucha en frente a las injusticias. Sabemos leer comunitariamente la Biblia desde nuestra realidad contextual y desde los pobres. Palestina está más cerca que lejos de América Latina. nos une la lucha, nos une la dignificación de los pueblos como un lugar hermenéutico al cual no podemos renunciar. Tenemos que hacer memoria de nuestro caminar latinoamericano. Muestra de organización y lucha son las conferencias de Puebla y Medellín, que van a tener fuerte repercusión hasta la actualidad en nuestra querida Abya Yala. El documento de Medellín sobre los conceptos de paz y justicia afirmará: son también responsables de la injusticia todos los que no actúan en favor de la justicia con los medios de que disponen, y permanecen pasivos por temor a los sacrificios y a los riesgos personales que implica toda acción audaz y verdaderamente eficaz. A su vez, Puebla, redactado en el año 1979, tiene en su contexto el auge de la teología de la liberación latinoamericana. Nos dirá al respecto Tamayo. Es una teología de la resistencia frente al imperio norteamericano, un nuevo poder colonial que pretende dominar el continente, y frente a la colonialidad y colonialismos internos y al subimperialismo. Se pone del lado de las víctimas de las sucesivas colonizaciones y recupera el carácter originariamente subversivo del cristianismo. En ella se deja oír de nuevo la proclama de Jesús de Nazaret contra los poderes políticos, económicos y religiosos de su tiempo, y la denuncia profética de Bartolomé de las Casas contra los encomenderos. Recuerdo con amor y orgullo cómo muchas personas palestinas me dijeron sentirse inspiradas por los movimientos y organizaciones de liberación argentinas y latinoamericanas, a saber, madres y abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, hijos, Movimiento Sin Tierra en Brasil. Y esto tanto en territorio palestino como en territorio de la Palestina histórica, el actual Israel. Ejemplo de ello es la lucha semanal en Jerusalén de Women in Black. Por otro lado, propongo la teología de la liberación y las teologías feministas como puntos de partida. Tanto la teología de la liberación en pleno auge como las teologías feministas van a ser base clave para las conferencias católicas de Puebla y Medellín en Latinoamérica. Nos dirá al respecto la teóloga Elsa Tames en el libro de Elizabeth Schussler, que el movimiento bíblico teológico feminista surgió en contextos revolucionarios y de luchas populares contra las dictaduras y las democracias. Fue a finales de los años 70 y principios de los 80, poco después del surgimiento de la teología de la liberación, cuando las mujeres con estudios en Biblia y teología comenzaron a hacerse presentes como mujeres y con conciencia de ser mujeres oprimidas por su género y no solo por su clase social. Será entonces pertinente revisar el rol del movimiento feminista, por lo menos en 3 contextos y momentos: en la Declaración de Barmen, en las conferencias de Puebla y Medellín y en la actualidad. No es casual que en la Europa del 1930 se estaba expandiendo la primera ola de feminismo, y también a la par un régimen totalitario, genocida y fascista como va a ser el nazismo. En ese contexto, la cuestión de la mujer se había convertido en un asunto político importante. Las mujeres reclamaban acceso a la educación y al empleo, salarios iguales por los mismos trabajos, cuidado de los niños y salud, derechos políticos y sufragio completos, cambio en las leyes sobre el matrimonio, posibilidad de divorcio, entre otras. La organización más poderosa de las feministas fue la Federación de Organizaciones de Mujeres Alemanas, que pasaría a su modo más militante entre los años 1890 y 1920, guiada por las críticas teóricas a las prácticas patriarcales. El periodo de represión y terrorismo del régimen nazi disolvió la Federación de Organización de Mujeres Alemanas en 1935, y el debate político, incluso en los círculos privados, se convirtió en una actividad peligrosa. Expresarán algunas de las mujeres intelectuales participantes de estos círculos que se salvaron entonces por el silencio. Y digo que no es casual porque podemos trazar un punto de comparación con el crecimiento de la 4ª ola del feminismo en el Río de la Plata, con una fuerte presencia de las mujeres, jóvenes, empoderadas, entrecruzando las luchas en planos de interseccionalidad y levantando banderas y creando puentes entre las luchas feministas, ecologistas, anticolonialistas y antirracistas. A su vez, y en paralelo, se erigen también los gobiernos de ultraderecha, que reivindican los periodos más nefastos y fascistas de nuestra historia reciente, instalando un negacionismo histórico que tiene implicancias directas en la vida de los pueblos. Un ejemplo de ello son los vínculos y las alianzas tejidos por el actual presidente argentino Javier Milei con el sionismo internacional, haciendo uso de la Biblia para legitimar el genocidio actual y la injerencia del Estado sionista en territorio argentino y latinoamericano. Hermanas y hermanos, prestemos atención, creemos alianzas con nuestras hermanas, las de aquí y las de allí. Aún recuerdo con amor y admiración a Manal Tamimi y a cada una de las mujeres del pueblo de Nabi Saleh que tuvimos la oportunidad de conocer. Ellas se propusieron participar activamente de la lucha y las manifestaciones pacíficas cada semana en su pueblo, en conjunto y a la par de sus compañeros. Esta semilla siguió esparciéndose cuando también ellas se propusieron hacer capacitaciones a mujeres en pueblos y aldeas vecinas en Cisjordania a fin de convidar a otras hermanas mujeres a la lucha, a habitar otras territorialidades en frente a la ocupación que no deja ni un centímetro sin ocupar. La reflexión sobre Palestina desde las epistemologías del sur nos dirá al respecto. Las mujeres palestinas tuvieron y tienen un gran protagonismo. La Nakba obligó a las mujeres palestinas a continuar, en numerosos casos, desde los campos de refugiadas y refugiados, con sus actividades diarias y cotidianas de subsistencia, trabajo y reproducción, pero esta vez con una mayor necesidad de solidaridad y de autosuficiencia comunitaria. El papel de las mujeres palestinas fue el más importante e imprescindible en todos los ámbitos vitales. Además, muchas mujeres, comités y grupos femeninos palestinos, más organizados o más espontáneos, establecieron numerosos mecanismos de apoyo mutuo y tejidos comunitarios de cohesión y solidaridad, además de convertirse en las más destacadas guardianas de la memoria palestina. Entre otros elementos, y ante la colonización y ocupación de su territorio y el intento de colonización y ocupación de sus cuerpos, en y desde 1967, algunas fueron sujetos activos. Palestina es la cuna del cristianismo. Necesitamos que nuestras hermenéuticas den cuenta de esto. ¿De qué manera? Tenemos una herramienta clave. Como cristianas y cristianos protestantes y luteranos, promovemos el sacerdocio universal de los creyentes. Predicamos el Evangelio. Es tarea urgente que ese Evangelio no quede aislado espacio-temporalmente en el tiempo. Urge vincular la situación actual de la cuna del cristianismo. ¿Cómo? A través de obras de teatro, de títeres, de podcast, con fotos, con testimonios, con música. Hay muchas formas. Creo que en este sentido el arte será una herramienta clave para ello. Aprovechemos la cercanía que nos propone Internet en nuestros días. Amplifiquemos las voces de nuestros hermanos y hermanas del movimiento cristiano en Palestina. Tendamos y fortalezcamos las redes con las comunidades latinoamericanas. Que las fechas litúrgicas estén empapadas de testimonios de allí y de aquí. Aprovechemos liturgias como las del Día Mundial de Oración, que en el año 2024 estuvo inspirada y escrita por mujeres palestinas. Distribuyamos el material de la revista bíblica latinoamericana, por ejemplo, la número 93, que fortalece los puentes entre Palestina y Latinoamérica. Imprimamos y distribuyamos folletos con los mensajes de Alerta Navidad y Alerta Pascua, elaborados cada año por Kairos Palestina. Tomemos en nuestros mensajes reflexiones, sermones, ejemplos, voces, puentes que nos acerquen, para continuar deconstruyendo la lectura fundamentalista del texto bíblico. Hacemos presente la voz del pastor Mionter Isaac con motivo de la Natividad en el año 2023. Aquí en Palestina la Biblia se ha convertido en un arma contra nosotros, nuestro propio texto sagrado. Aquí enfrentamos la teología del imperio, convertida en una herramienta poderosa para enmascarar la opresión bajo el manto de la sanción divina. Hoy, en Gaza, Dios está bajo los escombros. Si Jesús fuera a nacer hoy, nacería bajo los escombros de Gaza. Hemos de recuperar lo testimonial como narrativa. En tal sentido, creo que los testimonios de cientos de acompañantes ecuménicos latinoamericanos por el PEAPI, el Consejo Mundial de Iglesias, a lo largo de 20 años, enviados desde 5 países como Ecuador, Colombia, Uruguay, Argentina y Brasil, pueden ser una herramienta clave al momento de disputar las narrativas que instalan los medios masivos de comunicación. Necesitamos de una voz profética coherente y consecuente. Considero también que hemos de animarnos a decir también, tal como en Barmen, tal como en Accra, tal como en Belhar, nosotros y nosotras, no en nuestro nombre, no en nombre de la Biblia. Y esto no es antisemitismo, y esto no es ausencia de condena a jamás. Esto es confesar a Jesucristo, afirmando que el mensaje bíblico que promovemos como movimiento cristiano es un mensaje de justicia y paz entre las personas y con la creación, y que nosotras y nosotros para nada creemos en un Dios que promueva un discurso violento, que legitime ningún genocidio ni ninguna injusticia en ningún lugar del mundo. Hacemos propias las palabras del documento Kairos Palestina. Cristo vino a proclamar que el reino de Dios está cerca y provocó una revolución en la vida y en la fe de la humanidad. Nos trajo una enseñanza nueva, como dice Marcos, y una luz nueva para comprender el Antiguo Testamento y los principales temas que tienen relación con nuestra fe cristiana y nuestra vida cotidiana, tales como las promesas, la elección del pueblo de Dios y la tierra. Creemos que palabra de Dios es una palabra viviente que echa luz sobre cada uno de los periodos de la historia, manifestando a los creyentes lo que Dios nos dice aquí y ahora. Por eso es inaceptable transformar la palabra de Dios en letras de piedra que desfiguran el amor y la providencia de Dios en la vida de las personas y los pueblos. Esto es precisamente el error de las interpretaciones bíblicas fundamentalistas, que nos llevan a la muerte y a la destrucción, cuando petrifican la palabra de Dios y la transmiten de generación en generación como palabra muerta. Esta letra muerta es utilizada en nuestra historia presente como un arma que nos priva de nuestros derechos sobre nuestra propia tierra. El llamado es a que nuestra voz, desde este lugar del mundo en Latinoamérica, desde nuestra lectura bíblica y nuestro quehacer teológico, sea una voz profética, coherente y consecuente. Porque mientras estamos acá reunidos, sigue aconteciendo el genocidio en Gaza, que asesinó a más de 50.000 personas, solamente desde el 7 de octubre de 2023. Un 70% de ellos, mujeres y niños. Y esto constituye el más grande escándalo de la historia actual. No podemos ser parciales en nuestros repudios. Lo menciono porque mucho se señala a Rusia, pero no de igual manera se repudia a Israel. Necesitamos un movimiento desde abajo, desde las voces de las y los oprimidos. Boicot, desinversiones y sanciones a Israel. Porque mientras tanto el mundo sigue girando sin que las iglesias, las y los ministros de la palabra, las instituciones, tomemos real dimensión de las necesarias campañas pacíficas de boicot, desinversiones y sanciones al Estado de Israel, de declarar nuestras iglesias y comunidades de fe libres de apartheid y asumir a su vez las consecuencias que implica deconstruir el discurso victimista, que puede luego legitimar teologías que en nombre de Dios sean capaces de defender y llevar adelante un genocidio. Necesitamos entonces construir otras narrativas a partir de otras experiencias y testimonios. En este sentido, las voces desde abajo, no desde solicitudes con financiamiento ni desde una lógica colonizadora, sino desde abajo, las voces claman organizadamente para que nos sumemos al BDS, inspirándose en la propia experiencia palestina en estrategias de boicot y en la campaña similar que fue fundamental para la caída del régimen de apartheid sudafricano. El BDS constituye la mejor coalición de la sociedad civil palestina. Su objetivo es el cumplimiento del derecho internacional a través de 3 puntos básicos: el fin de la colonización y la ocupación militar de todas las tierras palestinas conquistadas en 1967 y el desmantelamiento del muro, el fin del apartheid dentro y fuera del Estado de Israel, y el respeto, la protección y la promoción del derecho de las personas refugiadas palestinas a retornar a sus casas y propiedades. La temática también es relevante ya que los proyectos colonialistas no finalizan con un único objetivo. Recordemos que esta ocupación colonialista ilegal no tiene su fin en Palestina, sino que continúa avanzando en otros territorios. A modo ilustrativo, ya son 12 las provincias argentinas que tienen acuerdos con Mekorot, la empresa israelí que roba el agua de los palestinos. De igual manera, el boicot académico, cultural y económico en diversas áreas de Latinoamérica está teniendo un fuerte impacto en Israel. Me pregunto, ¿hasta cuándo guardaremos silencio? ¿De quién no se puede hablar en esta época? No se puede denunciar al sionismo porque si no, vas preso y sos condenado o perseguido. Un testimonio de ello fue la detención ilegal y arbitraria de nuestro hermano Cristian Díaz durante 8 meses en Buenos Aires, a manos de las fuerzas represivas de la ciudad de Buenos Aires por ser acusado de antisemitismo a través de un posteo virtual. Entonces, hermanas y hermanos, claramente estamos ante un poder maligno, o si no, ¿por qué no se puede hablar o denunciar su accionar genocida? Nuestra voz profética, coherente y consecuente no puede ser parcial. Eso tendrá consecuencias. Pero no habremos guardado silencio cómplice y ensordecedor ante un genocidio en curso. Por último, propongo dos... Sí.
Sí, si podés ir
Sí.
concluyendo, Paula, gracias.
Propongo dos verbos, sembrar y parir. Una fuerza de invitación. Dos verbos manifiestos en la resistencia palestina y latinoamericana. El vínculo entre el vientre y la tierra sigue siendo clave para acercarnos y solidarizarnos con las causas de libertad, liberación y autodeterminación de los pueblos. Que el pueblo palestino siga sembrando variedades autóctonas de semillas y árboles de olivo, a pesar de que el ejército y los colonos incendien y corten aquellos milenarios árboles, es un acto de resistencia. Que las madres cada noche abracen las manos de sus hijos al regresar del trabajo, de la facultad, y a pesar de que el ejército les detenga, persiga y asesine, decidan seguir pariendo, es un acto de resistencia. Sembrar y parir. La gran causa palestina desde lo pequeño, desde la fuerza de las semillas, de la tierra, de los cuerpos amantes que engendran vida y que anhelan ver a su tierra en paz. Hacemos nuestras las palabras y convicción que pronunciara Leila Khalid en el acto en conmemoración por el Día de la Tierra Palestina que dice: ustedes deben saber que más temprano que tarde nuestra recompensa será la libertad y la victoria. Que el Dios Trino de justicia y paz nos bendiga, nos dé coraje y tenacidad para fortalecer nuestros puentes de luchas y resistencia desde Barmen a Palestina, para animarnos a decir frente al genocidio, frente al apartheid y la colonización de Palestina, no en nuestro nombre. Gracias.
Gracias, Paula. Perdón que tuve que cortarte, pero se nos estaba yendo el tiempo y queríamos tener un tiempito para compartir entre todos, todas quienes estamos acá. Quiero darle las gracias a las personas que hicieron las presentaciones. Creo que queda claro de lo que hemos oído el desafío inmenso que tenemos frente, desde el camino que nos marca tanto la confesión, la Declaración de Barmen como la Confesión de Belhar. Creo que en este tiempo está en juego la integridad de la Iglesia, de lo que cree, y más urgente es que está en peligro de extinción todo un pueblo. Como se ha dicho muchas veces, cuando uno habla del tema del sufrimiento palestino, se señala que es un tema demasiado complicado. Y justamente una de las respuestas que cree que es imparcial, pero es tomar parte por una de las partes, es el silencio. Y lo que queremos, lo que quisimos hacer, lo que queremos hacer con esta conferencia es animarnos mutuamente a no ser cómplices de ese silencio que mata. ¿Sí? Y parafraseando una canción de León Gieco, quiero compartir dos párrafos diciendo: pobre la teología que llega tarde, que aparece cuando todo pasó, que viene atrás corriendo como el paisaje que dejamos cuando nos estamos yendo. Más osada es la teología que te acompaña, que de dos caminos hace uno solo, brota de la nada y te señala qué lugar del alma está nuboso. Me parece que el rol, queridos hermanos y hermanas, es que podamos justamente levantar la voz, hacer acciones en favor de quienes son víctimas de genocidio, de apartheid, ¿sí? Y que justamente podamos renovar nuestra vocación de obediencia a Jesucristo, a quien debemos nuestra vida, justamente. Son las 12:33, tenemos 25 minutos para el diálogo. Mi propuesta es que podamos formular inicialmente preguntas para las ponentes, ¿sí? Si tenemos tiempo, después pasamos a comentarios, pero inicialmente quisiera que tengamos un tiempo de preguntas, así que les pido que levanten la mano y les daremos dando la palabra en orden, ¿sí? Katy,
Sí, tengo dos preguntas. Una tiene que ver con el panorama político actual en el hemisferio occidental, que me parece que va a ser un desafío enorme y cómo conversar con las iglesias que apoyan estas regímenes políticas que están en auge. Y la otra pregunta tiene que ver más bien con las respuestas desde el Oriente hacia la situación en Palestina, porque yo comprendo las tensiones colonizantes de las iglesias y las teologías occidentales, pero no tengo la imaginación teológica e histórica para comprender las teologías orientales y qué influencia tienen en Palestina. Dos preguntas.
gracias, Katy. Gracias, Katy. ¿Alguna pregunta más? Daniel Veros.
Bueno, quería agradecer las 4 ponencias. Me gustaría escuchar de parte de las 4 personas que han expuesto, pero también particularmente de mucho interés para mí sería cómo ve Muna como Palestina, cuáles son las prioridades principales de una acción pública, tanto desde el lugar de las iglesias como instituciones, pero también desde nuestro aporte, nuestra vocación como cristianos en el marco amplio de la política y la sociedad civil, ¿no? ¿Cuáles serían las estrategias que podrían contribuir a fortalecer el reclamo de justicia y el derribo del régimen de apartheid que está teniendo lugar en Palestina. ¿Cómo nos podrían ayudar a pensar esos principales desafíos? Gracias.
Daniel, gracias. ¿Alguna pregunta más? Paula.
Sí, es para Ulrich. Él mencionó un libro que escribieron y pienso que hay muy poca bibliografía en español, pero quizás nos puede indicar, ¿sí?, dónde conseguir el libro, si está en formato PDF. Creo que también sería un insumo para disputar estas narrativas y este tiempo presente. Gracias.
Gracias, Paula. Debo de decir también que está ya disponible una traducción del libro se me perdió el nombre, del pastor aluderano en Belén. Por favor.
Münter,
No.
¿no?
Bueno, después lo tengo el nombre en la punta de la lengua, pero no me sale. Después confirmo el nombre. No sé quién va a tomar las preguntas de Katy sobre el panorama político actual de Occidente y cómo conversar con las iglesias que apoyan estos regímenes, y también sobre el panorama político de Oriente. Tal vez podríamos dejar esas, y después tenemos una pregunta directamente para Muna. No sé, Ulrich o Alan, no sé si podrían responder las preguntas de Katy.
If I understand correctly, the question is regarding how to influence the governments. Is that your question?
The governments and also the churches that support the government.
Churches. Okay, yeah.
Oh.
Well, if I may just give my response from my knowledge, this is, of course, the question that our network is working on, and it is very, very, very difficult in Germany because of this, the whole society, politics, and also the churches have made a deal, as Mark Ellis, the liberation theologian of the United States, once formulated. You see, it is basically a kind of whitewashing of our own history that our interest is. And therefore we use the Holocaust to let Israel go with what they do with the Palestinians. It's otherwise they call us falling back to anti-Semitism. So it is this kind of deal that is operative in our situation. And also there is a book of a German Jew now in Hong Kong, Daniel Marwetsky, who has written a book which is very, for those who ask about the German situation, it's called Germany and Israel, Whitewashing and State Building. So Israel uses this bad conscience and this whitewashing of the Germans in order to somehow oppress the Palestinian issue. So that is the basic background, because why we have very great difficulties with politics, civil society, and also the churches. Now, we are trying to expose this mechanism, that they are basically doing a self-service when they let down the Palestinians and support the Israelis. But of course, and of course we have very good cooperation, and that is very important, with the dissident Jews. I mean, Jewish Voice for Peace, etc., etc. So we try to have this kind also of interreligious coalition in order to expose this self-serving policy which is behind that. Now, I think it would be very, very important for particularly the German churches that other churches challenge our churches. So as the South Africans did already, and as hopefully also we have a partner church in the United States, the UCC, United Church of Christ, and we have a co-worker here. I go through the congregations with people from the UCC, and they say, look here, this is what our decision is. So I'm just limiting myself to the German situation. It is different in the USA, where you have a far more explicit solidarity in the churches, UCC I mentioned, but others may talk about their countries. At least we try our best, but it's in this particular situation that we challenge also you to challenge our churches.
Gracias, Ulrich. La segunda parte de la pregunta de Katy en relación a cómo es el panorama político desde Oriente o cómo se mira desde aquella parte del mundo la situación de Palestina.
Político y teológico.
Y teológico, sí. Gracias, Katy. Alan, are you here? Are you hearing me? Alan?
No, I'm here. I'm here. I'm not sure what Gary means by the Eastern churches. Does he mean the churches in Eastern Europe? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah, I'm thinking about the Eastern Orthodox churches and maybe even churches of the Syrian traditions, the ancient Catholic churches, who have such a different history than the Western churches have, and they have their own struggles. But how are they involved in conversations about what's going on in Palestine, and what kinds of theological and political voices can they offer us in the West as we struggle with the Christian Zionism? I think my question goes kind of along that line.
Okay. No, so thank you for clarification on that one. I'm no longer as intimately involved in the World Council of Churches matters. Maybe Muna can tell us how our churches in the World Communion of Reformed Churches from Hungary and Romania and so forth, how they are responding to the WCRC's programs on Palestine, which I found very, very good and extraordinarily encouraging in our own struggles here for Palestine in South Africa. I remember, though, Carrie, in the 1970s and the 1980s, when the World Council of Churches took such a firm stand on the question of the church's involvement in the struggle against apartheid South Africa, churches from the Orthodox churches were very, very uninvolved. They had no interest whatsoever. And it was strange. I mean, the Russian government was supporting liberation movements in their struggle, especially in the question of military training and so forth. But I found in our conversation in those days, very few people from the Eastern European churches who really supported us clearly. Although in my term as president of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, going around the world, explaining the decision to declare apartheid a sin and a heresy, they did not oppose that decision. but they were very understated in their support. And I'm not sure Muna can tell us whether that understating support is still operative for those churches. I wanted to, though, say something, if we have the time, later on after Muna has spoken, on the question that Daniel has raised on strategies to support the Palestinian struggle. But that's all that's what I can say about the Eastern churches.
Thank you, Alan. Muna, can you pick up that aspect? How is the Orthodox churches are dealing with this?
Sure.
And also after that, if you can answer Daniel's question too, will be good.
Sure. I think it's multi-layered answer to the question. There is two aspects, in my opinion, that really we analyze the Eastern Church position on Palestine. So Eastern European churches have been very vocal about issues that about Ukraine, for example. They've been very straightforward, direct about what the churches needs to do for the justice of Ukraine. And I think that makes sense because it's also a very contextual geopolitical problem that is present amidst their own context. But on the other hand, they have been silent on Palestine due to many governmental as well changes. There has been like a very far right government, for example, in Hungary, but to be honest, I think that depicts a kind of double standards of the churches and Eastern European churches of how they are standing up for Ukraine, rightly so, but also how they are blindsided to issues that we can see very clear similarities with both, but they are willingly being silent about issues of Palestine. I think also the second part of that is that the Orthodox Church has been kind of like isolated from the whole ecumenical dialogue, I would say, about Palestine. And that really affects how they answer to Palestine, what's happening internally in their own churches, and how can we invest in dialogues with the Orthodox Church, because I mean, it's also a big church, a powerful one, and how can we enable such conversation is part of a bigger questions that we should be asking. But to connect what I'm saying now to Daniel's question, I think there is a kind of double standards when it comes down to Palestine in general, because I mean, if anything that last year has shown us is that, you know, there is very normalized anti-Arab propaganda that is really normalized in the media, but also there is double standards when it comes down to international laws being practiced in areas of the world. You can see main news agencies being very direct and vocal about when Russia bombs places in Ukraine and how many fatalities there is and who killed those people, but there is a passive tone when it comes down to the news title when it comes down to Palestine. You feel like Palestinians are being murdered because of a natural catastrophe, not that there is a deliberate, systematic, Western-funded, support to their murder. So I think we need, as churches, to really challenge this whole normalized racism towards anything Arab, because it symbolizes in their mind Muslims, and that there is a whole narrative that normalizes anything that we say and against Muslims. So it's this Islamophobia that we should really be tackling, but it's a bigger question of how do we break down stereotypes? How do you racist stereotypes about what the other is? And how do we really invite people to think critically when we talk about Palestine, that we should really distance ourselves from this whole it's complicated question, that it's not a religious question, that it's, you know, it's not all the Arabs against the Jewish people, it's Israel, the modern state, not Israel of the Bible. So I mean, there has been lots and lots of work that has been put into that, but there is also lots of ignorance by Christian people who are still uninformed and who are still really delving into this normalized racist narrative about Arabs in general, but also about the whole question of Palestine. So I think that's really important to kind of delve into when we talk about what we can do. But on the more practical level, I think BDS is a very strong movement that people can engage and can really make difference when it comes down to how internationally Israel is recognized. We need to boycott all the products, but we also need to sanction Israel, and we need to hold them accountable. We need to stop normalizing that they exist in so many cultural, academic spheres that it's unquestioned that their existence is still being questioned, not even questioned, sorry. So I think BDS is a very strong movement that we can all really contribute to. And we can also be critical about how Israel is present amidst our realities all over the world, because Israel controls the economy in so many different ways and in so many things that are essential into our own lives, and they have control over that. So I think these are two things. But most importantly, I think we really need to be really hearing from the Palestinians what we should be doing, because there's lots of information coming from Palestine, but there is this hesitance to actually hear from them and listen to what the Palestinian people are saying. So I think if we can all work within these parameters, I think we are bound to make a change about that. Sorry for my prolonged answer.
Thank you, Muna. Thank you so much. Before going to Ulrich, Alan, do you want to complement this?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that Muna is absolutely right. I mean, people must remember that the South African government went to the International Court of Justice solely because the South African public put so much pressure on the government. They were not willing to act at all. They were saying things because it is its traditional South African ideological stance to be in solidarity with Palestine. But beyond those words, they were saying nothing. And until we on the ground organized large marches, the first march was 10,000 people. The second large march in Cape Town was almost 200,000 people. And we were very forthright about our participation in that. When we did that, then it was that they went to the ICJ. The struggle now is, though, Dario, that the ICJ findings on the occupation and on Israel and all of those things have a clause that says all the countries that are underwriting this institution must now make sure that they cease and desist all kind of aid, any kind of assistance, any kind of support to apartheid Israel, which means BDS. Cut all trade ties, cut diplomatic ties, cultural ties. And that's what we are pushing the government. And our government goes to the International Court, takes the glory, but does not implement the practical consequences of what that stance actually means. And so the churches have to join with civil organizations. We have joined here with organizations, Muslim organizations on a large scale, to make sure that the government understands it's the voice of the people that is speaking. And that is the way that the churches can participate. For the church now to come out and simply make a statement is not enough. I don't even listen to it. I'm asking the churches, if we call for a rally, if we call for a march listing these demands. Will you be there? Will you be present? Will you speak out loud? And that is the way we should participate right now in order to make sure that we do the right thing.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much for this. I agree with you, and you're giving Moon, and you give a lot of way to deal with this. Ulrich, you want to say something? You are silent, Ulrich.
Sorry, yes. I wanted first to underline what Alan said. We will have a European march in Strasbourg at the Parliament just in 2 weeks from now, 27th. So pray for us. But my question was related to the Latin American friends here in the group. I quoted and I mentioned the All African Council of Churches together with World Communion of Reformed Churches and the Namibia Council of Churches, that they did this declaration on genocide and empire. And my question is, what about the Latin American Conference of Churches? I mean, could you not also mobilize? Because if we had if we had the impulses from Africa and Latin America, as we had in former ecumenical struggles, that would be great. And we could, so to speak, the global South could then challenge us in the global North, in the churches, etc. So is there a possibility, or is there already going on something? I mean, we have the call of the cry for hope, and we have the assignment of the WCC in terms of studying apartheid and coming to a decision. This is the formulation of the Assembly resolution. So you are called to a processus confessionis also in Latin America, or are you already involved in that?
Ulrich, I don't want to answer you completely your question, but the ecumenical movement in Latin America is, how to say, is unmobilized. It's not working, but we can take the task to push. This is something that we can do. And we will take that as a task for us. At the moment, there is nothing done on this aspect. It was done before, but it's not done at this moment, and we need to push on that. So thank you, Ulrich, for bringing this up. Okay, and I confusing everybody speaking sometimes one language and another. Sorry for that. Daniel.
Sí, no,
Daniel.
quiero agradecer el planteo de Ulrich, porque creo que es un gran desafío para este presente y para la experiencia de los últimos años, muy decepcionantes para nosotros quienes tenemos una apuesta muy fuerte al caminar ecuménico aquí en América Latina, ¿no? Y creo que es un desafío importante, y creo que también es una oportunidad, entiendo yo. Este mismo encuentro me parece que es una oportunidad que estamos teniendo aquí para, por lo menos las hermanas y hermanos latinoamericanos que estamos aquí en este espacio, yo desde este humilde espacio que estamos queriendo construir como red ecuménica de educación teológica, ofrecerlo, digamos, como una instancia a partir de la cual podamos desafiar a otros espacios de compromiso ecuménico en nuestro ámbito para tomar lo que aquí estamos escuchando, lo que venimos experimentando en este tiempo como desafío para el pueblo palestino, y para lo que Paula también subrayaba, ¿no? Esa comunidad en la experiencia de la colonia, en la experiencia del apartheid, en la experiencia que hemos vivido también aquí, cuando en un primer intento quisimos organizar este mismo encuentro y nos encontramos con la situación frustrante de experimentar el modo en que también a través de las tecnologías estas formas de intervención buscan desbaratar el diálogo, buscan desbaratar la oración conjunta y el desafío mutuo al testimonio. Por eso, gracias Ulrich. Desde aquí con Darío, con los hermanos y hermanas que estamos aquí, tomamos el, el- la invitación, el desafío y bueno, pienso yo que tenemos una buena oportunidad para impulsar instancias de articulación desde aquí también.
Gracias, Daniel. Y la última preguntita o contribución se la dejamos a Néstor.
Dale, por favor.
Gracias, voy a hablar en español, en castellano. Eh, con, con respecto a la pregunta de Ulrich, en primer lugar señalar que aún en algunos sectores, no todos, pero en algunos sectores de iglesias, digamos, moderadamente conservadoras en América Latina hubo alguna reacción. De hecho, Elsa Padilla, representante de la Fraternidad Teológica Latinoamericana, en el encuentro del grupo de Lausanne hace un par de meses, expresó su preocupación porque las iglesias evangélicas apoyaban el genocidio de Israel y pidió, por favor, explícitamente que las iglesias evangélicas condenaran el gobierno de Israel por este genocidio. Y tuvo una reacción muy desfavorable de parte de algunos de los componentes europeos y norteamericanos, pero ella después ratificó su postura en la Fraternidad Teológica Latinoamericana. Y tanto su exposición como la respuesta que dio después ante las reacciones adversas están disponibles. De manera que ese sí es un antecedente muy interesante porque viene justamente no del sector de las iglesias históricas, del protestantismo más conocido, sino justamente de un sector de las iglesias bautistas en Argentina, en América Latina, perdón. La otra cuestión que quiero señalar es que hace ya como 10 años que dejó de funcionar el CLAI, el Consejo Latinoamericano de Iglesias. Sin embargo, hay un intento de reponer algún tipo de red o relación entre las iglesias de América Latina de la tradición evangélica para volver a expresarse públicamente. El próximo lunes, lunes 18, el Comité Asesor Teológico de esta red se va a reunir en forma virtual y como yo formo parte de ese comité, tenía entre mis puntos a tratar justamente un apoyo de la red CLAI a el pueblo palestino en su lucha contra el apartheid y una condena al genocidio que está llevando adelante el Estado de Israel. Esas son dos cosas que puedo decir de caminos muy parciales, pero que de alguna manera están siendo recorridos en América Latina, además de la red de biblistas de América Latina, que como dijo Paula, hemos sacado ya un número dedicado especialmente a la cuestión palestina, donde los más conocidos biblistas de América Latina hemos escrito sobre esta cuestión. Esas son las tres cosas que puedo decir de lo que está ocurriendo muy tibiamente en América Latina y como dijo Daniel, pese a grandes resistencias, en el caso de Argentina, muy directamente de un gobierno involucrado en acompañar a Israel en este genocidio. Gracias por escucharme.
Gracias, Néstor. Y bueno, creo que ya estamos pasada la hora. No quiero tomarle más tiempo, pero sí quiero tomar un brevísimo tiempo para darle mis profundas gracias a las personas que contribuyeron a este diálogo y bueno, a quienes participamos como oyentes también y que es importante justamente la conexión para que nuestras luchas, nuestros pensamientos no queden aislados unos de otros, sino que podamos construir pensamiento y construir acciones juntos.
Darío, ¿me
Sí,
permitís una
Daniel.
cosita muy breve? Yo quiero agradecerles también a cada una de las personas y particularmente este, em, preguntarle a Muna de pedirle si nos podría ayudar a orientarnos para que esa solicitud, ese pedido que ella realizó de poder escuchar las voces de los palestinas y palestinos, pudiésemos canalizarlos de alguna manera a través de nuestro espacio institucional, ¿no? En algún formato que podamos convenir. Obviamente también la reflexión bíblica y teológica que se produce allí, pero me parece que todas las experiencias que ella considere relevante, nosotros, cuente con nosotros para hacer un canal de reproducción, de eco de una herramienta, ¿no? De lucha también desde aquí. Así que bueno, muchas gracias.
Bueno, muy bien. Muchas gracias entonces por su tiempo y sigamos perseverando en la resistencia, ¿sí? Porque como dijo Muna, no nos queda otra, es la única opción, ¿sí? Hoy sufre el pueblo palestino, si no levantamos nuestra voz, mañana sufriremos otros. Así que creo que es importante que podamos estar juntos en todo esto. Muchas gracias,
Gracias
Alan,
a todos.
Ulrich, muchas gracias, Muna, muchas gracias, Paula, muchas gracias, gracias a todas y cada una de ustedes.
Thank you.